So we've got jQuery installed in our web page, and what we're going to look at now is how you can run code once a page is loaded, and in fact why you would actually want to wait until the code's loaded on the page. I'll create a text field inside the page and I'll give it an ID of start time. So if we go and refresh the page, there you can see there's our new text field. Now what I'll do at the top is create a second script, and this second script is going to set the value of that text field. And first of all, in JavaScript we'll need to get a reference to the text field itself. So we'll do that by storing it in a variable called TextField, and then I'll use document.getElementById. This is a way of picking up from JavaScript a reference to an element in the web page, like the input text field, and it takes the ID of the field, in this case start time. Now if we take that text field, it's got a value attribute which is the contents of the text field, and if I set that to now, let's see what happens when we refresh the page. Absolutely nothing. Now why is that? We're running the script at the start of the page, and the browser will run that script before it's fully loaded all of the HTML. So that means that script's running, it's saying go and have a look for an element called start time, and because it's not loaded the input field by the time it runs the script, it doesn't find anything. So text field is undefined, and then the setting of the value will then fall over. That means that we need to wait to run our script until after the HTML of the page is loaded. And one way of doing that is by wrapping up all of the code that we want to run once the page is loaded inside a function. In this case we'll have a function called everythingIsNowLoaded. And we need to run this function once all of the HTML on the page is ready. Now we can do that in most browsers by adding an onLoad attribute to the body tag, and that onLoad attribute allows us to call a small snippet of JavaScript, which is our function, and you can see when we refresh the page we set the value of the text field. That's how you can do it on most browsers, but there are several other options as well. Instead of having an onLoad attribute on the body, we can go into the JavaScript and we can set the onLoad attribute to the window object, to the name of the function that we want to call. And again, if we save that and I go back to the web page and refresh it, it still works in the same way. The downside with running our function with an onLoad attribute is we can only have one at a time. So there's another way of calling it where you can use a function called attachEvent, and so you could potentially have several scripts being run once the page is loaded. There are several different ways of doing this, and different browsers have slightly different ways of working. So if you go for a very general way of running script once the page is loaded, you'll probably find that it will only run the script once all of the HTML and all of the images are loaded, for example. Or if you go for something slightly cleverer like attachEvent, you'll then find that certain versions of Internet Explorer won't run it at all because those versions don't support attachEvent. And it gets quite confusing. So one of the reasons for jQuery is to make things as cross-browser as possible. So let's look at how we can run code once the page is loaded in a more jQuery way. We'll keep the same function, but what we'll do instead is use the jQuery function itself to call it. Now jQuery can be treated as a JavaScript object. It can also be called as a JavaScript function, and in this case that's what we're going to do. So we've got the jQuery function, and what we'll pass into the jQuery function is the name of our function. And what that's going to do is once the page is loaded, usually just the HTML, it then calls the function that we gave to jQuery. Now just to prove that this is working, I'll go and change the text that we're setting in the function. If we refresh, there you can see it's an updated version. So that's how to run things once the page is loaded using jQuery. One benefit of calling things with the jQuery function is that we can call several functions if we want. So if we've got several pieces of code that need to initialize themselves and set fields on pages, all we have to do is call functions from inside jQuery, and then they will all only get run once all of the HTML on the page is ready. Now We need to fit in with the jQuery idiom. We've written the code, and this is going to work perfectly well, but it's not the usual way in which jQuery developers would normally write the code. What they would generally do is, instead of passing just the name of the function, they would take the whole JavaScript function and put it inside the jQuery function. Because we're passing the JavaScript function entirely in there, we can take the name off because nothing else is ever going to call this function. If you've been using JavaScript a while, you'll know that this is what's called an anonymous function. It's what in some languages you'd probably call a lambda or a closure. It's a way of taking a piece of code and passing it around to other methods and functions in the system. The other thing that we can do is replace the word jQuery with its alias, which is $. You'll see lots and lots of dollars in jQuery applications because $, is obviously a lot quicker to type than jQuery. But remember, $, and jQuery are the same thing. And this is how you would normally write code that needs to start up at the end of the page load. You begin with $, and then an anonymous function, and you end with a curly brace and a parenthesis like that, and then all of the code in the middle is what will get run when the page is loaded.